I've never been good at holding on to people. They come and go, sometimes in slow, quiet ways, other times in sharp, painful ones. That's the thing about people. No matter how much you love them, you can't make them stay. But things stay. Things carry stories. For my grandfather, that thing was his violin. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way fancy violins are, with their polished wood and gleaming strings. No, his was old, scratched in places, and the varnish had faded to a dull, uneven brown. The case had fraying edges, and the strings had been replaced more times than I could count. But to him, it was everything. He had carried that violin through war, across oceans, through a lifetime of struggle. It was the one thing he never let go of, no matter how bad things got. He played it every night, whether he was happy or sad, tired or restless. The sound of that violin filled every space he lived in. It was more than an instrument. It was a piece of him. I grew up in his tiny music shop, surrounded by the scent of wood polish and the clutter of instruments waiting to be fixed. The shelves were lined with old guitars, dusty saxophones, and cracked violins that people had long forgotten. My grandfather sat behind the counter, his glasses slipping down his nose as he worked, carefully bringing each instrument back to life. He barely spoke, just small, gruff sentences here and there. But when he played, it was like the words he never said were coming out through the strings. I didn't always listen. I was a teenager, too caught up in my own world, drowning in my own music, always thinking I was too busy to care about his. But even when I wasn't paying attention, the sound of his violin was always there, weaving itself into the background of my life. It was constant, like the ticking of a clock, like the heartbeat of that little shop. Then one winter, everything changed. Business had been slow for a long time, but that year it was worse than ever. Customers stopped coming in. Bills started stacking up. My grandfather, who had always seemed unshakable, suddenly looked older, more tired. I would catch him rubbing his hands as if they ached, staring at the shelves like he was already mourning what was about to happen. And then, one evening, I walked into the shop and saw the empty space where his violin had always been. At first, I thought maybe he had taken it home. But then I saw his hands, resting on the counter, fingers curled slightly, as if they were remembering the shape of something that wasn't there anymore. He had sold it. I wanted to ask why, but I already knew. The rent was due. The gas bill, the electric, the taxes, everything had piled up. He had done what he had to do. A month later, the shop closed for good. He never played again. I moved away, got busy with my own life, told myself that none of it mattered, that it was just an object, just a thing. But some nights, when the world was quiet, I could still hear it. The faint, ghostly sound of those strings, like an echo from another time. Years passed. Then, one cold evening, I found myself walking through a flea market. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering, letting my mind drift. I turned a corner, and there it was. The violin. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I stepped closer. There was the tiny scratch near the chin rest, the initials carved into the side, his initials. My stomach twisted. My hands started shaking. It was impossible, but it was real. I didn't even ask the price. I handed over everything I had, every crumpled bill in my wallet, and carried it home like something sacred. That night, I sat on my bed, holding it in my lap, running my fingers over the worn wood. It felt lighter than I remembered. I hesitated before picking up the bow, afraid that if I played it, something would be different, that the music wouldn't be there anymore. But as soon as the first note filled the air, I felt it. The sound was rough, unsteady, like it hadn't been played in a long time. But beneath that, it was still there. The same melody, the same heartbeat. And suddenly, I was a kid again, sitting in the shop, listening to my grandfather play. The next morning, I took it to my mother's house. I placed it on the kitchen table in front of her and stepped back. She stared at it for a long time like she wasn't sure it was real. Then, slowly, she reached out and ran her fingers over the wood. Her breath caught in her throat. And then, for the first time in years, she cried. Not soft, polite tears, but deep, aching sobs. The kind that come from somewhere deep inside you, from a place you thought had healed but never really did. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I would finally feel like I had done something right, like I had brought something back that we had lost. But that was the night the dreams started. They weren't nightmares, not exactly. Just flashes. The shop, the violin, my grandfather sitting in his chair, bow in hand, eyes closed as he played. But every time, the dream would shift. The shop would be empty. The violin would be missing. And then one night, he was just standing there, watching me. The next day, I got a phone call. It was about an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone I had left behind when I thought I was moving forward. He was gone. And suddenly, it hit me. Some things leave. Some things come back. And some things never really let go. I still have the violin. I don't play it much. But some nights, when everything is quiet, I take it out of its case, hold it in my hands, and listen. Because some songs never really stop playing. I didn't notice anything strange about the apartment complex at first. It was quiet, the kind of place where people mind their own business. Exactly what I wanted. The couple downstairs would nod if we passed in the hall, and the guy across from me, Michael, seemed nice enough. He even helped me move my couch when I first got there. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. The first time I heard it, I was half asleep on the couch, a rerun of some old sitcom playing in the background. A light tapping sound broke through the haze of my drowsiness. I sat up, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Now I lived on the 3rd floor. No balcony, no ledge, just a sheer drop to the pavement below. My stomach twisted. It had to be my imagination, right? But just as I convinced myself it was nothing. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, careful rhythm. Not frantic, not random, purposeful. I swallowed hard and crept toward the window. The blinds were down, blocking my view. My heart hammered as I reached out and, in one quick motion, yanked the cord. Nothing. The streetlights cast a dull glow on the empty sidewalk below. No shadows, no movement, just the usual city stillness. I let out a shaky breath and shut the blinds again, convincing myself I was overtired. A trick of the mind. But when I turned back toward my apartment, I hesitated. The deadbolt on the front door. I was sure, absolutely sure, that I had locked it earlier. But now it was unlatched. I forced myself to move, my hand shaking as I slid the bolt back into place. Then, just to be safe, I pushed my heaviest chair in front of the door. That night, sleep didn't come easy. By morning, I was ready to brush it off. But then I saw them, right outside my window, on the narrow strip of metal that jutted out beneath the glass. Footprints, small, bare, leading right to the window's edge. A sharp chill ran through me. That wasn't possible. I lived 3 stories up. My hands trembled as I pulled the blinds all the way up. I leaned out, looking down. The sidewalk was far below, too far for anyone to have climbed up. No ledges, no fire escapes, just empty air. I backed away, my breath coming fast. Maybe someone had done it as a joke, maybe some maintenance worker. But the prints were bare feet, not boots, not sneakers. Someone had stood outside my window, barefoot, in the dead of night. And I had heard them knock. I couldn't shake the unease, so later that day, I knocked on Michael's door. He seemed normal, sane, someone who would laugh and tell me I was being paranoid. But he didn't. As I told him about the tapping and the footprints, his face went pale. He glanced toward my apartment, then lowered his voice. "You need to leave." I let out a nervous laugh. Come on, man. It's just some creep messing around, right? Michael shook his head. The last guy who lived in your place, he moved out in the middle of the night, left everything behind. Didn't even take his furniture. I swallowed. Why? Michael's eyes darted to the hallway as if making sure no one else could hear. Then he leaned in. They want to be invited in. My skin went cold. I forced a chuckle, trying to play it off. Okay, sure, that's real reassuring. Who exactly are they? Michael stepped back, rubbing his arms as if a chill had settled in. I don't know, he muttered, and I don't want to find out. That night I locked every door, every window, pushed furniture against the front door, kept a kitchen knife on my nightstand. I wasn't about to let some urban legend scare me out of my own apartment. Then, at exactly 3:07 a.m., I woke up. The door handle was turning. I sat up fast, my pulse hammering. The knob twisted again, rattling like someone was testing the lock. Then, silence. A single knock, software almost polite. I gripped the knife in my shaking hands, not daring to move. Then, we just want to talk. The voice was muffled through the wood, flat and emotionless. My body locked up. My breath hitched. Another knock, louder this time. Please let us in. My stomach clenched. Something about the voices, was wrong. Too even. Too steady. Then came the laugh. Low. Amused. Like they were enjoying this. I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out or passed out because when I opened my eyes, the sun was streaming through the blinds. The chair in front of the door moved. The deadbolt unlocked. The knife gone. I grabbed my keys, shoved some clothes into a bag, and left. I didn't tell the landlord. Didn't cancel my lease. Just walked out the door and never went back. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the apartment listing online. The unit was already back on the market. New pictures, new description, and in one of the photos, standing just inside the front door, a figure, barefoot, smiling. I never minded closing up the bookstore alone. If anything, I liked it. The world outside was always so loud, horns blaring, people shouting, the constant hum of the city pressing in from all sides. But inside these walls, it was different. Here, everything felt slower, quieter, safe, or at least, it used to. That night, something changed. Gabe, my co-worker, left around 11:30, tossing me his usual lazy wave as he headed for the door. See you tomorrow, he said over his shoulder. Yeah, see you. The bell above the door jingled, and just like that, I was alone. I moved through my usual routine, straightening books, counting the till, making sure all the returns were in the right sections. The wooden floors creaked under my steps, an old familiar sound. The faint scent of aged paper and vanilla-scented candles lingered in the air, mixing with the distant aroma of coffee from the cafe across the street. I liked nights like this, but then I heard it, a soft click. I froze, my hand still on the cash register. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it was distinct. A door closing. I swallowed hard. The front door was locked. Gabe had been the last to leave. There was no way anyone else had come in. I turned slowly, scanning the aisles. The bookstore wasn't huge, but it had plenty of places for someone to hide. Rows of tall wooden shelves, the reading nook in the back, the tiny break room behind the counter. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling, or maybe a draft from somewhere. But as I stepped out from behind the counter, the air felt wrong, heavier. Hello? I called, forcing my voice to stay even. Silence. I walked toward the back, my footsteps softer now, my breath shallow. The office door was slightly ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness beyond. It had been open earlier. I was sure of it. I pushed it open the rest of the way. The tiny room was empty, just my boss's cluttered desk, stacks of invoices, and the hum of the mini fridge in the corner. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Still, My stomach was tight, my skin prickling with unease. I shook my head and exhaled sharply. "Get it together," I muttered. It had been a long day. I was just tired. Determined to shake the feeling, I made my way back to the main floor. As I passed one of the shelves, something caught my eye, a single book sticking out farther than the others. A little thing, hardly worth noticing. But I did notice. I reached up and pushed it back into place, my fingers lingering on the spine for just a second longer than necessary. I didn't remember pulling it out. I didn't remember anyone else pulling it out. But books don't move on their own. I shook off the thought and grabbed my bag from behind the counter. Enough paranoia. I was ready to go home. The store dimmed as I flipped the switches, one by one, the glow of the streetlights filtering in through the front windows. The silence felt different now, heavier. Then, just as I reached for the door, I saw it. Saw her. In the reflection of the glass, standing in the middle of the store. A woman, tall, motionless, staring straight at me. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to look, to confirm what I was seeing, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, pretending I hadn't noticed her at all. I gripped my keys tight enough to make my fingers ache, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Step by step, I reached for the lock, turned it, pushed the door open. The moment I was outside, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it as fast as I could. Then I ran. Ran down the street, past the cafe, past the darkened shops until I reached my car. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, gasping for breath. I sat there for a long time, too afraid to look up, too afraid to check if she was still there. But eventually, I had to. I lifted my head and glanced at the bookstore window. The lights were still off. The store was empty. No woman, no movement. But then, the book, the one I had pushed back into place, it was sticking out again. And this time, it wasn't alone. Several books along the shelf had been pulled forward, each one perfectly aligned as if someone had run their fingers along the spines, watching me, waiting. I turned the key in the ignition with shaking hands and drove away. I haven't worked a closing shift since. But I knew one thing for certain. I had become part of the Rialto's story, and I would never be free of it. I had never worked the night shift before, but when I landed my first job at the Grand Rialto Theater in 2010, I had no choice but to adjust. The place had once been a grandiose cinema, but by the time I got there, it was falling apart. Half of it condemned, the other half barely holding on. The lobby still had remnants of its former glory. Golden sconces, a marbled ticket counter, a chandelier caked in dust. But beyond that, the place was a graveyard of forgotten film reels and crumbling seats. My job was to oversee the projection room, though there weren't many screenings anymore. The theater's owner, a miserly man with a permanent scowl, insisted we keep up appearances, even if no one showed up. The second floor was closed for renovations, though it had been that way for years. There were whispers among the staff that the Rialto's old glamour hid something much darker, but I dismissed them as nonsense until the night I saw it for myself. I was alone when it happened. The last of my coworkers had clocked out early, leaving me with a single dim bulb buzzing in the booth. I was meant to shut things down, but I got distracted by an old film reel I'd found in a rusted canister labeled Final Performance. Curiosity got the better of me. I fed the film into the projector and flipped the switch. The screen in the empty theater flickered to life, and at first, the footage seemed ordinary. A silent film, a woman in a velvet gown standing under a spotlight. Then she moved, not like an actress in an old film, but as if she was watching me. Her lips parted, her expression shifting as though she knew she had an audience. A voice, not from the speakers, but from somewhere deep in the walls, whispered my name. My breath hitched. The projector light flickered, and the image on the screen warped. The woman turned sharply, as if looking behind her. I heard a sound behind me, a chair shifting. the creak of old wood. My hands turned ice cold. I spun around, nothing. Just the empty rows of broken seats and peeling wallpaper. But when I turned back to the screen, the woman was no longer there. The film kept rolling, but the stage was empty, as if she had stepped out of the frame entirely. The whisper came again, louder this time. My name, drawn out and hushed, like someone exhaling into my ear. That's when I ran. I abandoned the film, bolted from the booth, and didn't stop until I burst through the theater's entrance and into the night. I never went back. The owner called me for weeks, demanding an explanation, but I had none to give. A few months later, the Grand Rialto was condemned entirely, left to rot like the ghosts trapped inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I would hear faint echoes of a projector whirring to life, though I lived miles away from the abandoned theater. One evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to walk past the Rialto just to see if it was still standing. The structure loomed in the moonlight, its marquee sign long shattered, its doors sealed with chains. But just as I was about to walk away, a flicker of light appeared in the second-floor window. My heart pounded. There was no electricity in the building, and yet a soft golden glow pulsed from within, like a theater about to begin a show. Then I heard the music, a faint, wavering tune, like the score of an old silent film. It drifted through the air, growing louder, calling me back inside. I stepped forward against my better judgment, drawn to the sound. The front door, though bound in chains, creaked slightly open at my touch. I hesitated, then entered. The theater looked different. The dust was gone. The chandeliers gleamed. The velvet curtains rippled as if they had just been drawn back for a grand performance. I took slow, cautious steps toward the projection booth, unable to shake the feeling that I was stepping into something I shouldn't. The music swelled. I reached the door to the booth and, with a shaking hand, turned the handle. Inside, the projector was running, the film spinning wildly, its images a blur. And there, seated in the chair where I had once sat, was the woman from the film. She turned to me. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. But I knew what she wanted. I knew why she had called me back. The door behind me slammed shut. The whispering started again, the voices blending into the music, into the whir of the film reel. I backed against the wall, my breath ragged, my heart hammering. The woman on the screen stood in perfect synchronicity with the figure before me, her lips parting in an eerie, silent laugh. Then, darkness. When I woke up, the theater was in ruins again. Dust choked the air, the chandelier was broken, the seats were torn apart. But the projector still spun, casting a flickering, empty light across the room. I stumbled out into the street, gasping for breath. No one had noticed I was gone. No one knew what had happened. I never imagined myself living in a monastery. Yet, after months of conflict with my father, I found myself seeking refuge in one of the most isolated places imaginable, an ancient temple high in the mountains, where the wind whispered through the corridors and time seemed to stand still. My uncle, a traveling scholar, had arranged for me to stay there in exchange for helping the monks with daily chores. It wasn't a permanent arrangement, just a place to clear my mind and figure out my next steps. The temple itself was simple: stone courtyards, meditation halls, and rows of tiny wooden rooms where the monks slept. My room was at the farthest end of the corridor, away from the others. The walls were thin, the wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the only way in or out was a simple sliding door that didn't lock. At night, the silence was absolute. The only sounds were the distant rustling of trees, or the occasional hoot of an owl in the darkness. I had been there for about 6 weeks when the first incident occurred. It was an evening like any other. After a long day of sweeping the temple grounds, carrying water from the nearby spring, and helping prepare the monks' simple meals, I was exhausted. I ate quietly in my room, a bowl of rice and pickled vegetables resting on my lap, listening to the distant chanting from the prayer hall. It was a comforting routine. When the monks finished their prayers, the temple grew still. I lay down on my thin straw mat, pulling a threadbare blanket over myself. Sleep came easily until a sound pulled me awake. A voice. It was quiet, almost a whisper. "Who's in there?" I sat up, my heart hammering. The voice had come from right outside my door. At first I told myself it was one of the monks, maybe someone checking in on me. But why so late? And why such an unfamiliar voice? The candle beside my bed flickered as I strained to listen. Then, soft footsteps. Someone was walking down the corridor. But there was something odd about the way they moved. Slow, deliberate, too heavy for the light-footed monks. I swallowed hard, waiting for the sound to fade. It didn't. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath. Seconds passed. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. I clenched my hands into fists, my body rigid with fear. Then silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. No knock, no voice, just an overwhelming stillness. It was hours before I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next day I convinced myself I had imagined it. Sleep deprivation, paranoia. Anything was better than the alternative. But a lingering unease settled in my gut. That night, as a precaution, I moved my small wooden writing desk in front of the door. It wasn't much, but at least if someone tried to enter, I'd hear them. For hours there was nothing, just the usual quiet, the distant rustle of leaves outside. Then, thud. The door shuddered. I sat up so fast I felt dizzy. My candle had burned low, leaving the room in a dim, wavering glow. Thud. Again. Harder this time. The desk in front of the door scraped slightly against the floor, and then breathing. Low, slow, right outside the door. I clenched my jaw, every muscle in my body locking up. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but fear strangled my voice. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped, and something scratched against the wood. Not a knock, not a push, a scratch. A long, slow scrape, as if something was testing the barrier between us. My stomach twisted. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but where would I go? I was alone at the very end of the corridor. The monks' rooms were too far, and I had no way of knowing if this thing, whatever it was between me and them. So, I did the only thing I could. I stayed still. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke, the first rays of dawn were filtering through the wooden slats in my wall. I hesitated before moving the desk away, my pulse still pounding. Then I noticed something. The floor outside my door, just barely visible through the gap in the wood, had long, deep scratches carved into it. End night. By now, I was done pretending. I needed to leave. I packed my belongings that morning, determined to make the journey down the mountain at first light the next day. But as night fell, an unease settled over me like a thick fog. The monks went about their evening prayers as usual, oblivious to my growing dread. When I returned to my room, I placed my packed bag by the door, ready for a quick escape. But then, I hesitated. Something wasn't right. My desk. I had pushed it in front of the door last night, but when I woke up, it had been back in its usual place, as if someone had moved it. From the inside, a wave of nausea rolled through me. I had been alone all night, hadn't I? A sickening dread clawed at my throat. I turned slowly toward the door, preparing to grab my bag and run. And then I saw it. Through the thin gap, where the wooden panels didn't quite meet, a single unblinking eye stared back at me. I gasped, stumbling backward. The figure beyond the door didn't move. It just watched. For a second, my mind went blank. My breath hitched in my throat. My skin felt cold, like ice water had been poured down my spine. Then, finally, a whisper. Software just barely audible. "You're not supposed to be here." I didn't think. I grabbed my bag and bolted, nearly knocking over the candle as I shoved the door open. The corridor was empty. I didn't stop to check twice. I ran. past the sleeping quarters, past the meditation hall, past the altar that had once felt so sacred, so safe. I ran into the night. The next morning I reached the nearest village, exhausted and shaking. When I told the locals where I had come from, an old woman simply shook her head. "The monastery?" she murmured. "That place has been abandoned for years." My blood ran cold. Number, that wasn't possible. The monks, I had eaten with them, prayed with them. Hadn't I? I turned back toward the mountains, toward the place I had fled. In the daylight, the temple was barely visible through the mist. Empty, silent. And yet, I swear I could still feel it. Someone watching me, from the ruins above.